Hello and welcome back to Dagish America Presents. I'm your host, Ben Harrell, and I'm so happy to have the opportunity to talk to you again about the industry that I work in. Okay, on the last episode, we discussed some of the application and planning techniques we use when performing phosphine fumigations. If you haven't had a chance yet, please go back and give that episode a listen. I think you'll find it informative and entertaining. In this episode, we'll be talking to Sean Wilson, Regional Manager at Cardinal Professional Products, about the importance of monitoring your phosphine fumigation, why it's so important, and some of the equipment used to conduct that monitoring. Sean has over 27 years of experience in the pest management industry with a primary focus on fumigation and fogging, and so I couldn't think of a more qualified person to discuss this topic with. So, please help me welcome Sean to the podcast. Hey, Sean, how are you doing this afternoon?
Fine, Ben. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Great to see you, man.
Doing good. Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. I'm glad to see you face to face talking on the phone.
Yeah, we're doing something a little different on this podcast episode. Every now and then, most of the time we do this remotely, but every now and then if I'm close to somebody or if I can corner them and get them live, I always try to get them live so we can look at each other face to face and have a conversation instead of doing it via Zoom like we've all had to do over the last year and a half.
I've had enough of those, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, monitoring equipment for phosphine use. Yeah, this can be a pretty complicated topic occasionally. I think there's a lot of equipment out there, and I know more than one person has asked me a lot of questions on the different types of equipment and what they're used for. So I'm really glad that you agreed to come and talk to us today about all of this different equipment we're using and why we're using it in the first place.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the time and the opportunity. I think that, monitoring just in general can be a very complicated process. It can be very tough to understand why I'm doing it, why is it important to me, and that kind of thing. So hopefully we'll get through all that and get you some information out there for all your listeners.
Yeah, that'd be great. That's the goal.
I know.
All right, so hey, just to start out, just in case there's anybody out there who doesn't know who you are,
okay,
just do me a favor and just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and your relationship to the industry.
Okay, I sure will. So, it's 27 years of this industry in many different facets of the industry. So I've had the great pleasure of being able to be in different parts, from running a route and being an actual technician to management roles to corporate technical trainer. So that was about 15 years of my life. And then 12 years ago, I moved over into the distribution and offering training and support and sales and for the products that I use many, many times over throughout the years in the service industry. So It's been 27 years of actual doing fumigation or pesticide related industry in the industry.
Right, that's a long time. Yeah, and you've been doing fumigation the entire way.
The entire way. First week out on the job, my very first job was a methyl bromide job up in Iowa, and traveling 2.5 hours from point A to point B to get there to do that one little job, and it was crazy, and that was 27 years ago.
The times have changed.
Oh,
you don't do methyl bromide like that anymore.
No, I could tell some stories in regards to that job that I wouldn't want to tell nowadays.
We all have those stories, right?
Exactly.
All right, so right out of the gate, I kind of want to talk about some of the technical aspects of some of the equipment that we use, but more from a safety perspective. And our industry is full of acronyms. Everybody loves acronyms in the industry, and we hear a lot of these acronyms when it comes to safety in relation to the equipment. So I was hoping maybe you could just kind of give us a definition on what some of these acronyms are. So the two that I hear the most in the industry in relation to why it's important to monitor phosphine fumigations are TWA and STEL. So if you could just kind of define for us what those acronyms stand for and why they're important for monitoring phosphine fumigations, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think both of them, whether it be short-term exposure limit, STEL, or time-weighted average, they're threshold limitation values. They're both TLVs. So they're basically both giving you values that you have to either hit or miss, depending on your monitoring for efficacy or those kind of things when you're doing the monitoring side of things. But this is more for safety. They're actual values that we have to put out there for our the users of the products to make sure that you do not exceed a certain value. And I'll explain in regards to the different types. But if you overachieve that, then serious things can happen. that if you go over above that value.
Right.
Okay?
You're talking about health.
Yeah,
things.
health concerns.
Right.
Yeah. So exposure to the product. Okay. So for instance, on a short term exposure limit, it's a concentration of the fumigant to which, workers can be exposed continuously for a short period of time before they suffer the consequences, which could be, the irritation to even, causing some type of narcosis or drunkenness. So that's a short-term exposure limit that would be a concentration level. This would be more like 15 minutes or some type of lower time frame that level, which would be in this case phosphine at 1 part per million, if they're in there for 15 minutes or more, then they could have these types of symptoms. Okay, so it's a short-term exposure limit. Time, in regards to time-weighted average or the, what we call the PEL, the permissible exposure limit, that is the entry point of where you need to be at in order to allow re-entry into the structure or allow others to go into that structure or be able to use that, pull that commodity out or something. And that would be, in this case, for phosphine, 0.3 parts per million.
Right. And we all know that about phosphine, the 0.3 parts per million. We hear about that a lot.
But that is based on, remember, 40 hours work week, 8 hours a day. Those are what those levels would be associated. So you wouldn't want to be in higher concentrations of 0.3 parts per million or greater during that 40-hour week or that 8-hour day shift. And be constantly exposed to 0.3 parts per million during that 8-hour shift.
Right.
Or during the 40-hour work week, right?
And that's why that's the permissible exposure level. Because in your normal 40-hour work week, which I don't know too many fumigators these days that only work 40 hours, but the permissible exposure level is if you're working a normal 40-hour a week job, you can be exposed to up to 0.3 parts per million, and there's no adverse effects.
Yeah. Correct. So now, in case like, for instance, you're doing maybe you're aerating a bunch of cars and it takes a long day process and you're constantly aerating all those cars and you're being exposed yourself during those and you're not wearing the proper personal protective equipment, you could be exposed to levels greater than 0.3 parts per million for that 8-hour shift.
Oh, sure.
Over a shift. Yeah. So that's why we, in this industry, we all know that, you're going to wear a mask, phosphine canister mask at 15 parts per million or less to protect yourself from being exposed to 0.3 parts per million or greater.
Right, and I'm glad you mentioned respiratory protection, and I know we're talking more about monitoring equipment, but so what are those levels or those cutoffs for respiratory protection? I mean, because we're monitoring for these levels, so what are those cutoffs where respiratory protection is a requirement?
So like I said, 15 parts per million or less, then you could wear a phosphine canister style mask, which protects you and filters the phosphine gas through that cartridge. And that, is just a mask with and I know this is not video, but it's it's a mask with 2 side cartridges or maybe a single canister cartridge. It depends on the style that you might be using. Most are single style canister cartridges.
Right.
And then it filters out the phosphine, but that's at levels of 15 parts per million or less. Well, how do you know what the 15 parts per million or less is? It's because you monitor.
Right, yeah.
So therefore, that's why it's important to monitor, because you need to know the levels so you can know what kind of possible exposure you might be under.
Right.
Then anything 15 parts per million or greater of phosphine, then you would be a SCBA, which is a self-contained breathing apparatus.
Right, and that's when you're getting out the tank and the harness and in the mask and all of that stuff. Yeah.
And it has to be in positive pressure mode and those kind of things. And there's a whole nother podcast for you there, Ben.
Just on respiratory protection.
On respiratory protection. So, but those are the levels that you would be at. Now, if you're under 0.3 parts per million, there's no need to wear any respiratory protection. You're allowed per the permissible part of it, but always err to caution. And if you don't know, you should always wear that respiratory protection.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's the part of the label language and the part of the whole respiratory protection section that I think a lot of people gloss over, and it's that word unknown. If you do not know what that concentration is, you need to make sure that you're erring on the side of caution and that you are wearing some kind of respiratory protection. You cannot take a chance with this stuff. Fumigation is designed to kill. It's designed to kill pests, but it will kill us just the same way if we're not protecting ourselves. Yep. So if we're not monitoring that, we don't know what concentration that we're being exposed to. And that's why monitoring is so important. And I know you agree with me on that.
Absolutely. And that is safety monitoring. And then we'll get into the efficacy monitoring.
Yeah. So, you did mention that. So what is the difference between monitoring for efficacy and monitoring for safety?
Okay, well,
just kind of define that and explain the differences.
Well, so how I look at it, and I think others in the industry do too, is that, I'm trying to protect myself and others that I might be working with, and then also my customer's product. And so everything that I would do for safety monitoring is based off of protection of myself, protection of others, protection of the commodity, protection of customers.
Right.
And so those would be considered of where I don't want them to be exposed to anything, okay, or as much as possible, nothing, okay? And that is where that part of it is. Now, when you go into efficacy is what we want to hit on our target levels, on our killing the insect. We want to be at the exact levels we need. If our target's, say 800 parts per million, I want to achieve 800 parts per million for a period of time so I can kill that particular insect. And I know you've had other podcasts in regards to how that happens. But anyways, so therefore, that's why I'm monitoring. I'm monitoring not only for the efficacy of the job to kill the insects, but I'm also making sure that I monitor during the fumigation, after the fumigation, making sure it's safe for you and your customers and your coworkers.
And when it comes to monitoring for safety, there's really kind of two different ways to look at this. I mean, there's monitoring at the aeration process to make sure that you're getting under the 0.3 parts per million, but you're also monitoring for personal safety. You're monitoring workers' airspace, maybe during application, maybe during aeration, things like that.
Yeah, so basically when you go to a job and you're on that fumigation, there's what's called perimeter monitoring. And you're monitoring the perimeter of that structure or that possible fumigation that you're doing. Whether it might be a silo or a trailer or a rail car, anything where you've got contained gas inside there, you want to make sure that there is good perimeter monitoring done around it. Now, this gets into a whole nother topic of buffer zones and everything else, but it's not just what you're doing is you're protecting yourself to where if there is a leakage out of that structure, then you need to take care of that leakage. And that monitoring that you're doing will ensure and help you make that decision if you need to do that. And then keep people away from that area as much as possible.
Right. Yeah, it's so critical to be able to do that. I mean, the goal when we fumigate is to keep bystanders as far away as we possibly can, but not every structure is in the most opportune place that we have to fumigate. So there's many times that we have to cordon things off and we have to keep people out of certain areas because we just know, due to monitoring, that there's leakage in these areas and there's potential for exposure, and we have to keep people out of those areas.
Well, there in this industry, I've seen it, and I know you've seen it too in this industry as well in your service career. We've seen situations where we've had people that are doing some type of aeration right in a loadout that might be right next to a warehouse, and that warehouse is under operations. Well, you know what? You better make sure that is in a safe zone, and that needs to be maybe further out away from that facility. So those are things you have to make those decisions prior to your fumigation, not during your fumigation or during your aeration, And then going back to what we were talking about and other times we would want to do safety, well, like you said, is the re-entry level. So you want to make sure that is at 0.3 parts per million, so you can allow that individual, that maybe that coworker or maybe another, your customer's workers going in to get into that structure to pull that commodity out or to do something within that structure. And so that's the re-entry and the safety level monitoring that we do on the post-in aeration of it. So, I mean, those are the terminologies that when we get into it, kind of confusing to a new fumigator is the post, pre, all this. But I tell you, the fumigation management plan is the way to go to make sure that all that happens.
Absolutely.
So we all know that.
Yes, the F&P is critical, and it's a label requirement.
Exactly, and you discuss that with all your coworkers and your individuals.
So, we talked about the importance of monitoring both for safety and for efficacy. So let's talk now about maybe some of the different types of monitoring devices that are available, whether they're electronic or whether they're manual, whatever the case is. So let's talk about some of the different types of devices.
Okay, well, everybody that has probably been around a long time in fumigation, you definitely know of and seen and heard of colorimetric tubes. Tubes have been in the industry a long time, and they're used in different means, not just in the fumigation industry, but all over the world in all kinds of chemicals.
Oh, yeah.
They're detection devices that are manual in design. They, have a sampling to where you're pulling a sample in across a filter or a substance that allows the detection levels on the glass. So it's a colorimetric tube, they call it. And that gives you sampling of what levels that might be. But you have to have the specific tube for what you're doing. So for instance, when we were talking about efficacy monitoring, we're going to use a high range tube.
Right.
If you're using it for aeration or for clearing or for perimeter monitoring, then we're going to use a low range tube. And those are things that you just have to understand. And then in Canada, versus United States, because I deal a lot with Canada, Canada has a different level in regards to their reentry level. It's instead of 0.3 in the United States, we're 0.1 in Canada parts per million.
Right,
so
it's even tougher.
It's even tougher. So there's actually a specific tube for Canada. So that would be colorimetric tubes. They're ran through a manual pump or a sampling pump to where you can squeeze it like a bellows pump.
Right, so it samples air, like an air concentration.
Right, and pump the air across that filter or so many strokes to get that sample to come to the tube, to come across the tube.
And then there's a color change, right?
And there's a
inside
color
of
change.
the tube changes color to indicate.
Yep.
Content.
And for fumigation, it definitely is a color change, but there might be just level changes in other industries.
Right.
But anyways, but yes, that is absolutely correct. So that's one particular type of device in the industry for phosphine. And then we go into, actually electronic devices. And then when we get into electronic devices, then you're dealing with devices that maybe are more of my personal safety detection device, which is more of making sure I don't exceed those thresholds,
the permissible exposure
limits, okay, or the threshold limitation values. But yes, I don't want to get to that level. So therefore, that's a personal safety device. And it reads digitally by pulling it around its environment, okay? So it actually is testing the environment around itself, around the gas detection.
So it's reading continuously.
It's reading continuously, correct. And so, these types of devices would be held maybe on a lanyard around your neck, or it would be on your belt, has belt clips, something like that. It might be attached to your arm. It might be in, some way attached to yourself personally. And so those devices are personal devices. Then you have the devices for high range, which would be for actually sampling the gas levels that are inside your structure that you're fumigating. And so you're trying to pull that sample from a remote location. So that takes some type of pump to do that. And so these devices actually have internal pumps, air pumps, sort of like an aquarium pump, I guess, if I want to get a little analogy there going. But it actually draws that sample electronically through a battery and through, power source, and pulls that sample into that device, and then that device reads it at certain levels.
So it works in the same fashion as the personal safety device, but you have the addition of it having a built-in pump that draws a sample, like maybe through like a monitoring line from inside the structure.
Right. That's right.
So what are, obviously, continuous read is a huge advantage that electronic equipment has over, say, a manual pump or tubes. But what are some of the advantages and disadvantages to both? Okay.
Well, advantage big time right off the get-go on tubes is the expense. Okay. Because a unit like that, just a simple little hand pump and then some tubes, is going to be a low cost for that particular job. But I can tell you that if you're doing constant monitoring throughout that day or throughout the fumigation, you're going to blow through a lot of tubes.
Yeah, and the tubes are disposable.
Exactly. And then the disadvantage to a tube, price would be an advantage. Disadvantage to tubes is going to be, in some cases, is just the use of it. It's simple, but it's not. It does give you the capability. You have to break the glass. There's a certain step to do. It's not as easy as just turning a unit on, looking at a level, right?
Right.
You're actually having to physically, manually do what you're doing to test it. And if you don't get that right, you might not have a correct sample, right? You might not do the right correct strokes on it. It has an N equals and it tells you how many strokes. Right. So that would be a disadvantage. And then the other disadvantage that I've been seeing recently, and I'm sure you have too, there's a lot of plants now in industry that don't allow glass, because they're made out of
Yep.
glass, and there's a glass policies in a lot of these food plants now, to where you can't even bring the glass in on property.
Yeah.
Versus and here you are working with their inside their facility, or maybe in their rail car trailer next to their commodity, their goods going out to a customer, and here you are, you have glass in your hand,
Right, and you're breaking it on purpose to open it up.
Right.
Yeah.
So therefore, that would be a big disadvantage to that type of unit. Then you get into the clearance devices that are electronic. They're more expensive, most definitely. There's quite a considerable difference in price in some of these cases for the different types you got. It just depends on how complex you want to make your units. In some cases, certain companies, have certain sensors, and they can put so many slots and so many sensors in each of these units, and therefore it might drive up the cost of it.
Right.
But then at the same time, you also have some calibration that has to be done.
I was going to ask about calibration. So, I don't know if that's an advantage or a disadvantage, but there's definitely additional cost associated with that.
Oh yeah, I would say that in our case, in our company, we do all of our calibrations for most of our customers that allow us the opportunity to do that for them. But these are required every 6 months. Normally, and most manufacturers require every 6 months that a gas detection, electronic gas detection device be calibrated.
Right.
And so these calibrations, must be under certified kind of standards, and you have certain gas concentrations that have to be calibrated to, and you have to make sure you have the right temperature and the humidity inside there when you calibrate and everything. It can't be done. Calibration can't be done in a service vehicle or any kind of somebody out on the job. You have to have this done in a controlled environment.
Right.
So therefore. It has to be.
There's definitely a difference between a bump test and a calibration. A calibration is a much more controlled environment than a bump test.
Yeah, bump test, just you're detecting that the unit can read that particular gas that you don't want to be exposed to.
Right.
And so some companies require, for their individuals that might be at their facility, that all of their gas detection devices go through a certification of a bump test. But in our case, in the fumigation industry, because we calibrate on a normal basis, and we're also using it on a normal basis to get levels, bump tests not necessarily are something that we do, and maybe we should do more of, because you never know when your unit's going to be,
right. But technically, anytime that alarm goes off,
exactly.
It's being exposed to something. That's a bump test.
That's a bump test.
I don't know if everybody would view it that way, but technically that's a bump test. It's being exposed to a concentration of phosphine.
That's correct.
So based on all this, we all know that accidents happen in our industry every single year. Do you think that some of these accidents or safety issues that we have, do you think that a lot of these are a direct result of either a lack of monitoring or improper monitoring?
I mean, luckily, really, truly, in this industry, as far as reportable and things that we actually get to hear about, we don't hear as many as probably what's out there.
Right.
But I can tell you that if injuries and things that have happened is due to, not having the correct equipment for the job. I've, been involved in some situations with customers that maybe really thought they had the right piece of equipment that they were supposed to be using, and it wasn't the correct equipment. It was something that they used maybe for another type of fumigant, and they were using it on that particular job thinking it was going to be the same thing, Unfortunately, it goes back to the person, and you need to make sure that you read the labels and you understand the labels and read the manufacturer requirements of that particular piece of equipment that you have.
Yes.
They
all have instructions. Read the instructions. Operating
Some
instructions.
of them might not be as good as others. I think we could we could say that, honestly. Some of them read like French and different types of, but it can be very challenging. But there's many in the industry that, like myself and like yourself in this industry, that we're here to help and, reach out to somebody and get the right answers, right?
Right.
That's the key point. But to go back to injuries that have happened, yes, I would say that a lot of those, if you've came in exposed to any of phosphine, it's probably because you weren't doing the correct monitor. You weren't taking the precautions needed on yourself to make sure that I wasn't standing in levels that I shouldn't have been standing in, or greater than 15, parts per million, and I don't have a mask on, know. So.
Well, and I mean, there's a certain level of machismo that I've seen in the industry as well. I mean, the just hold your breath and run through
Yeah.
I hate to say that I've heard that happen, but I've heard of that happening in the industry. So
Sure.
please, anybody listening, don't do that. Use the safety monitoring equipment.
Well, I
please.
always tell this story, Ben. It's not a story. I just make a comment when somebody says, "Well, I'll just hold my breath and run through there." Yeah, you might be able to hold your breath, and you're the next Michael Phelps, right? And you can hold your breath. But guess what? You trip over something, all that air is coming out, and you got to breathe back in. So I would definitely make sure I got my personal protective equipment, or I monitor that situation, right? Because you never know when an accident's going to happen. You're going to trip over yourself.
And it may not be your fault.
It might not be your fault.
So,
anything could happen. Yeah.
All right, so I only have one more question for you, Sean. I appreciate your time today, but
no problem.
We have a lot of new fumigators that are coming into the industry, and we expect that we're going to see many more over the next decade.
I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Somebody's got to replace me or us.
So what kind of advice would you give to a new fumigator? Somebody's fresh out of the gate. They may not have even ever been on a fumigation at this point. What kind of advice would you give that brand new fumigator about the safe use of phosphine?
Always read the label. I'm not going to say anything more than others that have been doing your podcast, that you definitely want to read the label, absolutely, and understand the label. But I think it's more important that we always don't get caught in this I know it all kind of situation. Because I tell you, you know what? Knowing it all is going to get yourself in a whole heck of a lot of hurt. It will. You think you know it, but you don't really know it, and you need to understand it. And to this day, 27 years, I'm still reading labels. I'm still trying to understand labels. There's a lot of interpretation sometimes in our labels, and we want to make sure that we're always looking to always better ourselves. So if you're somebody out there that's just starting out in fumigation, get the knowledge, understand, get with a mentor, somebody that you always look up to in the industry. My current boss is somebody that I looked up to in the industry before I went to work for him,
Right.
And I was actually his customer. So, he was a resource for me. There's been others in this industry that I've always looked up to that throughout my service industry that, they had the knowledge. And in some cases, quite honestly, maybe they made mistakes and I learned by their mistakes. Because they know that they made a mistake, so you learn by those mistakes. But in this industry, one mistake can be very fatal. And that's what we got to remember. It's not just like putting pesticides around and spraying here and spraying there and maybe making a mistake. And then you've maybe contaminated something or you caused some irritation on somebody's skin or something like that. This is actually could kill somebody. And that's why it's very important to step back and understand the situation that you're dealing with. Make sure you've read the label, you understand the label, and then move from there and move forward. Never stop learning. That's it. That's what I can tell you.
That's great advice. Open-minded. Keep your mind open. Exactly. Regulatory requirements change all the time. Yes. Labels can change frequently. Yes. Like you said, interpretations of labels can change. And every fumigation's different and requires, in some cases, different types of processes in order to be successful. Right. Don't walk in thinking every rail car that you're going to fumigate is going to be the same.
It's not cookie cutter. No, it's always changing. And one thing that's changing all the time is the environment. You know, your temperatures are changing, you have a different wind direction, you have different things. So, somebody that comes to you and says, "Hey, I've done that job 100 times and this is how it is and this is what it does," and you go out there on that 101st time and guess what? It didn't go off the same as the 100 times before, Always there's something that might happen. So always just understand that and don't be scared of the products, but just understand the products. And the way this industry and the labels have been written and the fumigation management plan is all for your safety. And it's due to mistakes that have happened in the past. And we try to learn from those, and then, unfortunately, we have to create more regulatory situations. But there is a lot of equipment, there's a lot of information out there, there's a lot of resources at your fingertips that you can use on your job and do it right and do it safe and go home at night. Or day, or whatever.
That's the goal. Kill the right things, and you and your coworkers and your customers going home safe to their family at the end of each day.
Yeah, I wonder where you heard that one from.
Yeah. All right, well, Sean, thanks a lot. I really appreciate your time today.
No problem.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it, and please keep this up. This is great stuff. I really enjoy the podcast, and I think it's very valuable out there in the industry. So hats off to you and Degas for doing this. Great job.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
All right, man.
You take care.
Take care, man. See ya.
I want to thank Sean for taking some time today to discuss monitoring phosphine fumigations. Monitoring for efficacy is critical to verify success, and monitoring for safety helps keep you and bystanders safe, so it's terrific to have some clarification on the subject. In the next episode, we'll discuss one of the hottest topics of conversation regarding phosphine, the possibility and potential for phosphine resistance. And hey, remember, if you have a question you'd like for us to answer during our live season finale, please feel free to send it to us at podcast@degashamerica.com, or we'll always be happy to answer your question right away. You can also find us at degashamerica.com or on all of the main social media outlets. And so until next time, I'm Ben Harrell, and I hope you have a safe and terrific day.